shook her head. She gazed down at a picture in her hands, a photograph of an elderly woman smiling, standing in front of a house resembling any typical family photograph. She sighed, her shoulders burdened by the weight of everything. "This is my mother," Leah stated, her voice faltering. "She passed away 5 years ago, but Kyle, he's never seen a picture of her. I don't know why he's saying there's an old lady in the corner, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. I felt a chill traverse my spine, though I couldn't elucidate why. It was likely mere coincidence, correct? But when Leah held up the picture for me to observe, I halted in my tracks. The woman in the photograph, she bore a striking resemblance to the old lady Kyle had been describing. Leah's hands trembled as she gazed at the photograph, and for a moment she remained silent. Kyle's never met her, but perhaps he knows her somehow. Perhaps he remembers her. I observed as Leah turned to her son, who was now peacefully slumbering, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, his gentle murmurs the sole sounds in the room. I didn't know what to articulate. It felt incongruous, yet also appropriate in a manner I couldn't express. Perhaps it was merely the solace of a child's innocence, or perhaps, just perhaps, it was something more profound, something beyond our comprehension. As Kyle rested, his small hand clenched tightly around his toy truck, I couldn't help but contemplate. Was it feasible? Could Kyle genuinely have perceived something or someone that we couldn't? How could he have depicted a woman who had passed away long before he was even conceived? Leah departed that night, still perplexed by what had transpired. Kyle, thankfully, made a gradual recovery, and while his health ameliorated, he never again spoke of the old lady. But occasionally, I reflect on that day, the toddler who knew too much, and the old lady in the corner, and each time I do, I can't help but sense that occasionally there's more to this world than what we can perceive, more than what we can touch. Perhaps the veil between life and death is more tenuous than we realize, and perhaps, just perhaps, some individuals, some children can perceive it. Hello, companions. Thank you for viewing. A special acknowledgement to our subscribers. You perpetuate these eerie narratives. But here's the crux. Only 30% of viewers are subscribed. If you relish our content, subscribing aids us more than you realize. It requires a moment but makes a significant difference. While you're at it, like and share to maintain the chills forthcoming. Thanks again, you made this feasible. See you in the subsequent one, if you dare. I've toiled in the ICU sufficiently long to witness my share of misfortune. Accidents, critical conditions, the type of trauma that leaves one's heart heavy long after the shift concludes. But there are instances in this vocation that leave one questioning what one believes one comprehends about reality, what one believes one comprehends about the surrounding world. It transpired late one night in the early hours when everything in the ICU appeared to hold its breath. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about the shift, no significant emergencies. The patients were stable, at least momentarily, and the customary equipment maintained their rhythmic pulsations. The night nurse and I were in the break room reviewing the charts when the call arrived. It was a code, a violent accident. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, was brought in following a car collision. His body was battered, contused, and fractured. His injuries were severe, and we labored swiftly, hurrying him into the trauma bay, endeavoring to stabilize him. His blood pressure plummeted, and we were compelled to act promptly. It was the type of case that induced one to hold one's breath, pondering whether he would survive the night. His name was Tyler, and I recall the initial occasion I observed him. Blood pervasive, yet his countenance so serene, as though he had been rendered unconscious by the sheer force of the impact. His respiration was shallow, and the monitors emitted a constant, disconcerting rhythm. We strived to stabilize him for hours, cognizant that the odds were unfavorable, but we persevered, and for a period we believed perhaps he was prevailing. His vital signs commenced stabilizing, his pulse fortified, and although his wounds were grievous, he remained alive. That's when events took an unusual turn. It was approximately an hour later when I returned to the room. I had been affording the other nurse a respite, assuming Tyler's care momentarily, when something captured my attention. Initially, it was nothing, merely the customary clutter of gauze and bloodied bandages dispersed across the floor. But then I looked upward. There, on the ceiling, on the unadorned white tiles, was blood. It wasn't merely a minor spatter or the customary detritus from a trauma case. No, this was something distinct. There were multiple streaks, glistening red markings that extended across the ceiling. It was as though the blood had been sprayed upward, as though it had been propelled into the air. But there was no feasible manner in which that could have transpired. The room was excessively tranquil. I froze, gazing at the ceiling, endeavoring to comprehend what I was perceiving. How could that be? How could there be blood on the ceiling? We had reviewed everything, every detail. Tyler's injuries were appalling, but we hadn't observed anything that could elucidate how blood would culminate above him. We had the standard procedures in place, naturally. No equipment should have engendered a spray of this nature. The ceiling was excessively elevated for a spatter to reach it without some form of external force, and there hadn't been any abrupt, unforeseen movements or mishaps that could have dispatched blood skyward. I summoned the other nurse, my voice tremulous as I gestured toward the ceiling. She stared, her countenance blanching as she comprehended what I had perceived. We both knew something was amiss. We didn't desire to leap to conclusions. Individuals in the ICU are frequently in critical condition, and events can become unpredictable. But this felt incongruous. The blood defied logic. There was no manner in which it could have splattered that elevated, not with the force we were exerting, not with the type of injuries Tyler had sustained. Following scrutiny of everything, we discerned that the blood wasn't emanating from any particular source. It wasn't even consistent with his injuries. It wasn't splattered in the manner one would anticipate from a wound that was actively hemorrhaging. This blood was present, suspended somehow, as though it had materialized from thin air. We cleansed it meticulously, gradually, as though endeavoring to efface something we couldn't fully comprehend. But irrespective of how many occasions we wiped down the ceiling, irrespective of how many occasions we endeavored to ascertain how it transpired, the blood defied logic. Tyler's condition commenced deteriorating shortly thereafter. His vital signs plummeted once more, and he was ultimately pronounced brain dead. Despite our every endeavor, despite our every exertion, Tyler did not survive. But it wasn't solely his demise that haunted me. It was the blood. That night, following Tyler's transfer to the morgue, I returned to the ICU to conclude my rounds. I was fatigued, emotionally depleted, but there was one element I couldn't dismiss: the recollection of that blood. I persisted in contemplating it. How could it have reached that location? How had it splattered across the ceiling in that manner? As I stood in the now vacant room, something unusual transpired. The atmosphere in the room felt disparate, colder. The silence protracted longer than customary. It wasn't solely the tranquility that ensues following a loss. No, this felt amiss. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath. I looked upward at the ceiling, and momentarily I almost anticipated perceiving it once more. The blood, fresh and vibrant, painted across the white tiles. But it was absent. The ceiling was immaculate, the room sterile. Everything was as it should have been, but I couldn't forget what I had perceived. I've toiled in this ICU sufficiently long to comprehend that demise, particularly the violent variety, can occasionally leave an indelible mark, a vestige of something inexplicable, a lingering presence, something that cannot quite be elucidated by science or rationale. Perhaps it was merely an anomaly, some peculiar coincidence that culminated in the blood on the ceiling. But I've invariably pondered whether there was more to it. The mind operates in peculiar manners when confronted with trauma, and the body reacts in manners we still don't fully comprehend. But that night, I couldn't help but sense there was something more profound, something beyond the corporeal that we were not intended to perceive, something that yearned to be recollected. Tyler's blood had been on the ceiling, but that wasn't the sole remnant he bequeathed. You realize when one has toiled in a locale such as this for an extended duration, one commences perceiving everything: life, demise, the intermediary, the fragile instances where everything hangs in equilibrium. But even then, there exist narratives that halt one in one's tracks, narratives that induce one to question what one believed one comprehended. This constitutes one such narrative. It was a Wednesday, akin to any other at the ICU. The days coalesce, but this one was distinct. We had a gentleman arrive, middle-aged, a typical individual. His name was John. He had been outdoors with his companions, enjoying the lake, a tranquil respite to escape the monotony of existence. But somehow, something went awry. They discovered him in the water, face downward, lifeless. By the time they extricated him, he had been submerged for over 20 minutes. No pulse, no respiration. His body was frigid, his skin assuming that pallid, sickly hue that no one should ever be compelled to witness. They didn't believe he was returning. We labored on him, we exerted every effort. Thoracic compressions, intubation, everything the protocols dictated. We didn't cease, even when the seconds felt protracted. 20 minutes devoid of oxygen. I was executing what I was obligated to execute, the motions so ingrained within me that I no longer needed to contemplate them. But profoundly, I comprehended this wasn't favorable. I comprehended the probabilities were slender, and we were all merely endeavoring to cling to that sliver of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, we would retrieve him. And subsequently, it transpired. A flutter, a respiration, and John's thorax moved gradually, feebly, yet sufficiently for us to discern we weren't combating a futile cause any longer. He was alive. He remained in a coma for 3 days. We monitored him, scrutinized him meticulously, awaiting any indications of vitality. But when he ultimately opened his eyes, I could discern it in his countenance. Something was disparate. The manner in which he gazed at me, the manner in which he conversed with the physicians and nurses who tended to him, it wasn't identical to someone who had merely awakened from a profound slumber. It was as though he recollected everything. He commenced conversing promptly regarding what he perceived, what he orally perceived. I stood there astounded as he depicted events in such vivid detail, events he couldn't conceivably have known. He discussed the auditory perceptions of the hospital chamber, the vocalizations of the nurses and physicians as they labored on him. He depicted my hands, the pressure of the thoracic compressions, how I had moved with precision, almost mechanically, to salvage him. The auditory perception of the oxygen mask being affixed to his countenance, how he sensed the frigidity of the chamber on his epidermis as we endeavored to rewarm him. He recollected everything. But here's the salient point. John wasn't merely recounting occurrences from a few minutes prior. He depicted the cogitations we harbored, our incertitude, our dubiety. He could inform us when we had momentarily ceased laboring on him to confer with one another. He recollected hearing us converse, murmuring regarding the probabilities, pondering whether we were squandering time. He apprised us of a discourse that none of us knew transpired. He stated, "You apprised me I wasn't going to prevail." He articulated it with a serene tranquility, as though he had orally perceived those words within his intellect. The nurse who was accompanying me at the time, her countenance blanched. She hadn't articulated that audibly. It had been a cogitation, something no one had uttered aloud. But John orally perceived it, he sensed it, and yet he remained present. I could discern the incredulity in the physicians' visages as he depicted, in crystalline clarity, our endeavors to resuscitate him. He depicted the thermal energy from the defibrillator paddles, the jolt of electricity traversing his physique, the trepidation in the atmosphere as time continued elapsing, and we pondered whether we were belated. How did he comprehend all this? How could he recollect? We speculated perhaps he was disoriented, perhaps merely some adverse effect of the trauma, but as he persisted in conversing, it became apparent John wasn't bewildered. He wasn't hallucinating. He was recalling everything, every instance, every cogitation. He had perceived it all. I shall never forget the expression on his countenance when he apprised me, quietly, in a vocalization that barely disrupted the quiescence of the chamber. I orally perceived you. I orally perceived all of you conversing. I could orally perceive everything. There was a peculiar serenity in his vocalization, as though he had reconciled himself to something. He wasn't irate, he wasn't timorous, he was cognizant. I've witnessed numerous individuals traverse here. Some depart with nothing more than a few sutures, and some depart for the final occasion. But John's narrative, it's distinct, not owing to his return, not owing to the marvel of his survival, but owing to his conveyance of something with him, something I cannot quite elucidate. He reminded me that perhaps we don't invariably comprehend what individuals experience when they're insentient, when they're departed. Perhaps their intellects cling to entities we cannot perceive, cannot palpate. Perhaps they recollect. When he ultimately departed for home, weeks subsequently, he was a disparate individual, not solely corporeally. He was still recuperating, but emotionally as well. I recall him revolving toward me prior to his departure from the ICU for the final occasion. He gazed at me with this peculiar, but tonight he appeared to be agitated, twitching, muttering faintly in his slumber. The monitors emitted a slightly accelerated pulsation, and his physique moved subtly, as though someone was palpating him. But there was no one in the chamber with him. I stood at the entrance, observing. His eyes were occluded, his countenance placid, but subsequently his hand moved. His digits twitched as though they were being guided by something imperceptible. His hand gradually ascended as though someone was grasping it, gently coaxing it upward. I could sense the piloerection on the nape of my neck. I didn't comprehend what was transpiring, but something didn't feel appropriate. And subsequently, in the periphery of my ocular perception, I perceived it, a silhouette. It wasn't a deception of the luminosity. No, it was something more somber, something more substantial, yet diaphanous, almost akin to a silhouette. It was standing at the pedal extremity of Marcus's bed, towering, slender. The figure wasn't sufficiently distinct to discern, but it was present, merely standing, observing. I blinked, and the silhouette was absent. I didn't desire to remain in the chamber. I didn't desire to gaze at the bed any longer, but I was compelled to. I possessed a vocation to execute. I entered to scrutinize Marcus, ensuring his vital signs were stable, ensuring everything was functioning. I was compelled to concentrate on that. But as I stood by his lateral aspect, I couldn't dismiss the sensation that I wasn't solitary, that someone else was in the chamber. I departed hastily that nocturnal period. I inhaled deeply when I egressed into the frigid air of the corridor. Perhaps I had been toiling excessively protracted. Perhaps exhaustion had ultimately ensnared me. But I comprehended one entity for certain. I would never again traverse past that bed without a constriction in my gastric region. In the days that ensued, I commenced orally perceiving additional narratives from other nurses. Some patients had inquired regarding the peculiar figures they had perceived in the chamber. Others had mentioned orally perceiving vocalizations, sensing as though someone was palpating them, guiding them. No one could elucidate it, but the narratives were identical. There were murmurs, silhouettes, imperceptible hands. No one was acquiescent to articulate it candidly, but everyone comprehended which bed was accursed. We don't discourse extensively regarding it any longer, not overtly, but it's present. The chamber where entities transpire, the bed where no one ever remains for an extended duration. Some patients recuperate impeccably, but others, they never persevere through the nocturnal period. And whenever I traverse by it, I cannot help but sense as though I'm being observed, as though there's something awaiting the subsequent patient to occupy that bed, and as though the murmurs have already commenced for